super excited for this chat today on employee advocacy. So we all think we know what it means, the promotion and awareness of an organisation and or its products and services by employees. Most organisations either have a programme set up or they know they need to, simply because employee advocacy is going to happen anyway. It's going to happen organically through socials, word of mouth, etc. And having a program in place really helps leaders influence the narrative in market. The thing is, it can be expensive at implementing the tools, and there's also no guarantee that the uptake will provide a return on your time or investment, right? So to help your thinking around employee advocacy programs, I'm delighted to have two leaders with me today who are going to share some of the lessons that they've learned implementing such a program so they can hopefully help you save time and resources from basically making the same mistakes. So welcome to Billie Kessel, Global Employer Brand Manager at GSK. Hi, Billie.
Hello, how's it going?
And our long-standing EBW leader, Hannah King, Head of Global Employer Brand and Joint Ops at Straumann Group. And ex-GSK. So yes. Not a coincidence that you're here together then?
No, not a coincidence.
So on that coincidence, I'd love to start with a bit about like your background around your experiences with employee advocacy and why you felt compelled to share the good, the bad and the ugly.
We launched the employer brand as part of the rebrand. I've worked on agency side previously before I joined GSK. So when I say agency side, not recruitment agencies, but employer branding agencies. So I've worked with many clients who wanted to bring on an advocacy program of some sort. What I always find interesting, having worked with different organizations, different sectors, is what do people consider an advocacy program? Is it, spray and pray on LinkedIn, or is it actually something more of a strategic approach that's more targeted and long-term? The other big thing I think that we can talk a little bit more about is what happens once you've launched that advocacy program, who's maintaining it, who's moderating it, how does that have more longevity? Because I think in my experience, having done this a few times, setting up an advocacy program is great. Quite often there's a lot of people who are involved at the beginning, and then sometimes it will fall off a cliff because people won't have the resources to continue managing it, which means all of that upfront investment is only really for that first firework. So I think that's always an interesting one as well. Is great that you've got the idea and you've done the work. What are you now going to continue to do with it?
Yeah, it's definitely not a kind of one-stop shop, is it? Or it's not. I think we're going to talk quick fix versus kind of long-term solution. But yeah, just dispelling that myth again, and as Billie said, with that investment up front that you've inevitably got to put into something. How do you then manage it across your business for them to understand that it's, it needs to just continue to grow and evolve and be built on. It's not just like, oh, we can do this and we can spend a load of time for 3 months and then it's just going to manage itself. Yeah. That just isn't realistic.
Yeah, of course. So I guess with that lens on, I'd kind of like to address the elephant in the room, which is what everyone's wondering, well, great, who then owns an employee advocacy program? And, and why? So, what are the pros and cons, and who have, in your experience, have you found is the best and perhaps even the worst place to really encourage active participation and momentum, keep momentum? That's a lot of questions in one, but you get the gist.
Yeah. So I think my experience, just again working for large companies in general, and it doesn't just apply to advocacy, is if the logical owner, i.e. employer brand, owns advocacy, then all of your employees automatically default to employer brand. It starts to feel like it's a talent acquisition objective. And what you're ultimately trying to do, though, or deliver through advocacy, is empower your people to tell the story. And my kind of view and takeaway on it is that if it's rolled out as an employer brand process or program, you're kind of inhibiting your employees from actually truly advocating. Now, the challenge that then sits alongside that is, if you're going to say it's business-led, which is my personal opinion, is you want like someone reasonably senior with some clout within the organisation who's passionate about this to drive this forwards. How do you identify them? For them to be that level of kind of seniority to be able to kind of really rally the troops and drive this. And I'm going to say something that's maybe a little bit controversial, but there is a chance that they may fall outside of that kind of being digitally focused and digitally aware because of the age that they've got to have that level of experience. So how can you upskill them? How can you keep them going? And certainly over the years, you know, when I've met with stakeholders across GSK or Credit Suisse, where I was previously, one of the big challenges or pushbacks that you often get when you're trying to kick off an agenda is, I don't have time for this, I don't have capacity at this, HR keeps throwing and throwing and throwing stuff at me. So how can you move it to the top of the agenda to really, really have that sort of business ownership and business drive, obviously with the support of employer brands? So for me, that's your kind of pinnacle that you're trying to reach, but I think you probably need to go through stages and evolutions to get to that point. Certainly at the moment, I've got no idea who I would approach in my organisation to really, really kind of sponsor a programme. Billie, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you, to be honest. Although I think there's a not one size fits all because it depends on the business. So I think that it's always a partnership with leadership and quite often comms, because if you have comms on board, they usually will have a good reach to the company. I think sometimes we get siloed in HR trying to do these quite interesting campaigns and activations, but it gets stuck. So partnering with brand and comms is important. I also think partnering with different senior leaders within the business. So if I think about, say, GSK, for example, we have lots of different parts of the business. We have vaccine, supply chains, etc. So actually a senior leader in each of those spots, having almost like a sponsor to help you, or a comms lead in each of those to help you. So almost having a committee, but a lot of the drive is coming from employer brand, but it doesn't necessarily look like that to the employers. So we might create the framework, we might create the program, but then we hand it over to the leadership to try and implement that in their department or their business unit. That can come with its own issues, I think, as well. So that's why I think there is sometimes a not one size fits all approach. So you have to look at what is your business, what are you trying to achieve? It might be that you want to go specifically for tech, for example, in which case you're going to go down more of a narrow, more linear road. Whereas if you're trying to do something more broad, then you need to think about all those different partners, and therefore you're going to be managing different stakeholders. But I think it's always going to be down to how your organisation is sort of built and how your relationship with comms is anyway as the employer brand team, because that can also definitely be nuanced between different businesses.
I think that comms piece, and you know, we're amongst friends, so I think we can talk quite freely about it, is that relationship with comms can be great in certain organizations and more kind of inhibiting in others, depending on, you know, the industry that you're working in, depending on the culture, depending on potentially maybe even geographical kind of location and how your comms partners feel about that. So I guess the other challenge that then comes up with that is if you're going to be partnering with comms, and actually when I did a bit of a kind of very, very soft pilot to see how some employees within Straumann would react to the idea of this. And to be fair, comms just said to me, get on with it. As long as nothing goes out that looks utterly terrible, that's fine. But I know that for Billie, she's in a completely different situation. And if anything went out that was kind of less than perfect, comms would be going a little bit crazy about it. But it's how can you then move things on and keep a program like this going without getting tied up into those quite heavily regulated and rule-driven processes that our colleagues in comms are very, very used to kind of navigating through, whereas advocacy should feel a little bit freer and less of a corporate, overly drafted voice. So
we talk about it being a lot of the way we do it is to talk about being freedom within a framework. Because if we go back to what I was saying at the beginning about the fact that it's going to happen anyway, this is like we're talking about, it's trying to be an enablement piece, put some structure to it. And as you were saying, Billie, you know, one size doesn't fit all, but for GSK, it's got to be much more structured than perhaps for you, Hannah at Straumann, and kind of, you know, looking at that. But, you know, if we sort of say it's that freedom between a framework piece, and you mentioned about this earlier, Hannah, what would be, your sort of learnings around, and you mentioned this, a quick fix versus a longer term strategy? Because sometimes, especially when you've got a larger organization, it's like, I don't know where to start. So I kind of agree. And, you said you need to have a champion. I would absolutely think you need somebody in leadership to absolutely sponsor it. But I also would agree with Billie that sometimes it's about, okay, what's your priorities as a business? Where do you start? Maybe start there, prove impact. So, what would be, I'd love some humorous learnings here, but, quick term wins versus longer term strategies, do's and don'ts.
I feel Sorry, speaking over you already. I think that a quick fix for me, it is still advocacy, but I think it lends itself more to recruitment marketing rather than employer branding. I think true advocacy is more of a long-term strategy with more robust planning and framework behind it. I think a quick fix is a really good way to prove to the business why it works, though, through a recruitment marketing campaign. So say you have a business need, you're having a specific campaign and advocacy is wrapped into that. That's a really good way to get buy-in and prove, look, this has worked before. However, I would say definitely a longer term strategy is a proper advocacy strategy, because you can't go back and listen to someone's story or read someone's story from a year ago if you're looking for a job now. A year ago might be okay, but as those testimonials or as that advocacy content gets older, it becomes less effective. Therefore, it's sort of redundant. So I think that having that constant beat, that constant sort of that constant posting or activity from champions or advocates, that is where it starts to become and to make a difference on that long-term basis. Having said that, short-term fixes, it's not that they don't work, but I would say that it's much more of a recruitment marketing activity rather than an employer brand activity.
I really like the differentiation when I said, sorry, Hannah, but just when I was saying right at the beginning about what is employee advocacy, that was a really nice little pocket of actually, employee advocacy can be recruitment marketing. I quite like that versus a long-term engagement build program. And I think that would help some people think slightly differently about what they can do in the medium to short term. I really, really like that explanation, Billie. Sorry, Hannah.
No. So I guess when we're kind of talking about, the good and the bad.
And the ugly.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay. So let me start with the ugly. And again, this is, I've been perusing LinkedIn for some examples, and I saw someone, and I won't disclose which organisation she works for, but it wasn't this organisation. It wasn't GSK, and I'm obviously connected to her through someone at Straumann, but she's quite an avid user. Like I'm, when you recognise someone's name on your LinkedIn feed. So she obviously posts a lot, which from her organisation's perspective is great. Like she's an amazing advocate. She's in sales, and she was doing this post about let me introduce you to my team, which is such a lovely idea, like being able to, if you're a team of 5, particularly if you're in something like sales, which is super customer facing, and there could be cross referrals, such a great idea. And then she went down this route of, it was a bit, aren't we so cool? Because there was a lot of anecdotes about, at the end of the night, she's the one who you're most likely to find snoozing under the table, and so is the one that you're most likely to find dancing on the table. And her heart was obviously in the right place, and she obviously feels very, very fondly about her team, and I'm sure they have a great time. And she's obviously trying to get across the fact that they're super fun, they're really kind of colloquial and informal, but is that appropriate for do potential clients, potential team members in that sort of online forum really need to know about your nights out on the lash? It's a bit like that whole, if you're going to take a picture, take it before the wine's open. So I think, and I can imagine, well, I know for sure that if it had been one of someone from GSK and comms had seen it, it would have been one of those like emergencies that Billie had to deal with first thing in the morning. So I think there is, it's how can you give your employees the freedom? Because like I say, that idea of having, this is my team, is lovely, and probably really, really impactful for the right kind of audience. But how can you do it without the more enthusiastic people escalating?
That's the framework piece, right?
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. Yeah. I think from an example again of, I said before, I'd done this soft launch, if you like, and it definitely fell into the recruitment marketing track. We were hiring for salespeople across Western Europe, just looking to try some different things. I didn't have much budget, so I did a bit of very, very kind of quick and dirty content creation, and then briefed 4 of our core markets on how they could use my company on LinkedIn to just push out those posts. And I would say there were pockets of the organization where it really was so apparent why we have a massive need as an organization to drive like a digital focus, because there were people who have never logged onto their LinkedIn accounts. And these are like, pretty professional people. There were people that, hadn't updated their profiles in 5 years, so couldn't access any of the content. I spent a lot of hours kind of being like a LinkedIn help desk to try and facilitate this process. And again, it's that, how are you effectively going to resource a program and troubleshoot, particularly if you're not in the most digitally advanced organizational culture?
Yeah, and I think we take it for granted with LinkedIn, and it's something that Hannah and I were talking about the other day is LinkedIn, my company's great. We use it at GSK as well, but trying to get that built out to the wider business to get them using it outside of just HR. And it's great. We have to lead by example, but it's not, always the most authentic if it's always coming from HR and recruitment. But that education piece for the wider business is definitely something I'm working on as well, even if it is simply logging on to LinkedIn and sharing posts at the very sort of like, at the very minimum, but even trying to get people to do that, they don't even necessarily know what LinkedIn My Company is. So we have sort of a talent magnet program where we try and train and enable not only recruiters, but the wider business. But it is an uphill slog to try and get them to do that. The other example I saw of a really good advocacy, and actually it is a specific recruitment marketing specific, but they've kind of got their own mini employer brand within tech at Vodafone. So it's a case study I saw the other day, and they used not only the advocates who were part of the campaign, they also used them. They were involved in creating the headlines with the copywriters. So they were really involved in the whole campaign itself. Now, obviously that's not going to work every time because resource, time, more cooks in the kitchen, all those sorts of things. So it's not realistic for every time, but I thought it was a nice way of linking together the advocacy with the wider campaign work. And also it meant that the advocates and the people that were part of it were really bought into the whole part because they had been listened to and part of that process. So they're seeing headlines that they helped write up on, assets and they did a bit of out of home and that kind of thing. So I thought that was actually quite a good idea to have them not just come in blind, because we see the whole picture, right? We know that advocacy is part of our activities. Sometimes there's an education piece to the people who are going to be involved. We can't just assume that they understand the full purpose and what part of this bigger puzzle they're playing. So as much as you can have them involved and bring them on that journey with you without it being, without turning into a tutor for them, an employer brand, I think that does really help as well.
Shout out to Dawn at Vodafone for that, because I'm sure that falls under her scope.
Shout out to Dawn, yeah.
I think, where are you, Dawn? Come and talk to us. I think the other bit, and we've kind of mooted around it a little bit, is that education. So you've got that bit. This is all just building the picture of like how much resource and effort and energy you need to plow into these things. But I think the other piece is, again, we are, Billie and I, our contemporaries, we kind of live in the data as well. We make all of our decisions based on what we've seen before, based on what we know is working. There's sometimes a bit of gut feel, but if we're going to ask for money, we always have to say these are data points that we can consider, and this is what we're going to measure. But then when you've got, say, a group of employees, and if I go back to this sales campaign in inverted commas that I was running, a lot of the questions I was getting was like, okay, well, what is the impact that this is actually making? And an employee, an employee who doesn't work in, say, a marketing role or doing this kind of work, doesn't really care about awareness building. They don't get it. They don't. It's a difficult concept because it's a bit it feels a bit cotton wool fluffy. What they care about is, has the efforts that I've made generated more applications? And actually what we see time and time again is, if advocacy is more, certainly from my perspective, around kind of surround sound rather than bums on seats. And I was seeing like some great data around, impressions and around click through to landing page to see more content. But what I wasn't seeing was any real spike in applications. And I mean, we're talking single digits. So you've got these people who I've kind of corralled, sort of forced into helping me with this project, who are then feeling slightly disengaged that how they perceive that purpose is purely to drive applications, but actually what they were doing was super important. So there's that work around how do you educate your business in a way that isn't overly arduous and overly kind of data about the purpose, why it's important, and how it feeds into the overall picture as well, which I think, I'm sure there has been sessions, or there's sessions coming up again, because it's a continuous question we're having to ask ourselves in employer brand. But it's like, what is that measuring framework? How can you communicate it? Because some of it just is never going to resonate in hard numbers. So yeah, I think
metrics are so important, and whether that is, as you said, whether that's brand awareness, which is fine, but then who needs to know about brand awareness? Probably not the employee, because that seems like a waste of effort. But maybe that's just something's brand you need to know, okay, we're out there. But things like increase of hires, applications, time on site, so there's a whole heap of data metrics that I feel that we need to bring together for people to say, okay, I can either use a tool that will help me with these metrics, or we can measure this easily internally, or we put something together, a framework that but what's important to our business. And it might be something as hard as, I'm just going to focus on talent acquisition and how many hires this program brought in. It might be that simple, but that also helps, I think, communicate it back to the employees. It's like, guys, you've got people in your networks, bums on seat. This is, an epic kind of, the same way we would do it with an employee referral program, right? Celebrate success. And that kind of leads me to, I think, the last question, because, and for folks listening, I did say at the beginning, this is 15 minutes. If it's 12 or it's 18, that's fine. I think we're going the latter. So if it's
it'll be 38.
If you're still here and still listening, this is the last and the best question. And I think we sort of head in that way, but it really is around, what do you think the future of employee advocacy, looks like? I would say, for example, metrics. I would say, my view is pockets. What are all the different things? So it may not be one thing. Employee advocacy, we've got an employee advocacy program. It's how many advocates do we have? How many live advocates do we have? How many bums on seats? So they could be multiple. That for me is about hard measurement of programs now.
I do think that measurement is so important, again, just to hammer home that point, because, our argument is that it needs to be continuously managed. So you need those metrics to be able to build that business case to be able to consistently run a robust program. What I would like to see is more creative content being created by the advocates. Obviously, again, within the framework, so it's branded in the correct way and all that jazz, but more like, are people really feeling empowered to be able to tell the story in a way that isn't kind of, again, forced or not so glossy. Let's put it that way. Less glossy, less glossy, more. Not obviously not choreographed TikTok dances, although that I've seen Marks and Spencer's, and that is amazing.
Is it enabling about consistency, right? And, from continuity, as you said right at the beginning, about not just one piece. Hey, I'm Mel Green, and this is what I have to say, but maybe more softly and a bit more like continuous. Yeah, but continuous. A steady drip feed rather than like this is the one thing because I was tasked with doing this and I've got to do it, but also shifting culturally the appetite internally
so that employees feel empowered, but also so they want to tell the story, like that pride piece. And GSK in particular, like I haven't been at Straumann long enough, and because I work remotely, I haven't maybe experienced it quite as much, but certainly GSK, people that work there, they love the place.
Really passionate people.
In a way that I've never experienced before. So how can you internally create the mechanisms and create that sense of freedom and engagement for people to be able to go off and do that without utterly terrifying comms and the CEO and shareholders and so that's what I have in my mind as where I would love to see, just in general, our colleagues across the world in employer brand see that kind of instance. Yeah.
I completely agree. And it needs to be peppered through your comms plan. It's not just a one and done, for a campaign, or now you've done the work and that's it. As I said at the beginning, how are you going to manage this? How are you going to keep momentum and keep interest going? It can't be all the same, but it has to be consistent, obviously. And we've all seen the data, right? We've all seen the different various studies around how candidates look for jobs, what people's appetite are for applying for jobs. Job boards are now becoming a thing of the past that we don't use as often. Low-hanging fruit, fine, good for high volume roles. But when we're trying to find different kinds of skill sets, candidates are more likely to want to know about the company from their own people than marketing materials. So it's becoming more and more important that we take notice of advocacy. However, it's that maintenance and trying to get people involved internally and understand that importance as well, which I think is, the ongoing sort of struggle. The thing to what Hannah was saying is around, let's get away from the glossy, because that makes advocacy almost redundant if it's overly engineered, overly edited.
Yeah, you or me may as well have been directing it, right?
Exactly. Like you might as well have just done it yourself and sent them something to post. And that's where I lean a little bit more into UGC, because for me, that's where you can, how do I say this diplomatically, where you can get around stringent rules with brand, because you're using UGC that sometimes might be different to how you would say do professional photography for the website, for example, in which case, of course, that goes through brand. You need to be following the treatment, the styles, etc. Whereas when you're leaning more into UGC, you have a little bit more freedom. Of course, brand will still be involved from a sort of sign-off perspective, but often that is my way of saying, well, this is an authentic piece from an employee. It's a user-generated piece. Therefore, it's not being created by a comms agency or an internal content team. The purpose of this is truly to be authentic. And in fact, if we over-engineer it, we've lost the whole purpose of this piece anyway. So lean into UGC. I think it's a really good way to move away from having to be, always within whatever comms or brand want you to do.
But I think the next iteration of that for me is having the necessary frameworks and guidance in place where you can just completely eradicate that sort of approval process as well. Like the goal would be, I could do a 360 video of what my working space looks like and post it, rather than it being, now I've got to send it through to employer brand who are then going to get it comms approved. So I think, and that's going to take time, it's going to take trust, it's going to take trial and error, it's going to take learning from mistakes, etc. But where you'd ideally like to get to, obviously with the, example I mentioned earlier about talking about how people like to go out and get drunk, you'd like to get to a point where people can just go ahead and do that. You then just need to find a way to be able to keep that under umbrella to measure it. Yeah.
Trust and knowledge, trust in your employee, knowledge from your employee of what they can be talking about, and then as you just said, that last piece about measurement.
Yeah.
And it is simple, like when you look at it like that, but I think we're going to get there, and I think it's still going to be a bit of an education. But we're starting it, folks. We're starting that education. And thank you so much. We are way over 15, but I'm probably not going to cut any of this except for this bit, obviously. Kidding, guys. Thank you so much. I reckon we're going to have to do something like this again and bring more people to the table to discuss it, because it is super interesting. Hannah, Billie, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure listening to you.